Hi, everybody. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And this week, including yesterday, we've been talking about a few things around a culture of inclusivity. And our expert here today is Christina Blacken, who's the founder of The New Quo, which is a leadership consultancy and particularly focuses on these issues around inclusivity and storytelling as a mechanism for getting at that, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And this is a question that I've had a ton as when I was the CEO of a big company, and lesser extent on a small team now, because I feel like it's easier to manage. But the question is, I've got a team and I want to create an inclusive culture. What do I do to hold my team accountable for creating that inclusive culture? And thank you for joining us. Would love any wisdom you got.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here. So the first thing I will say is identifying if you fall into what is called a culture of autopilot. So it's a term that I've coined around some conventional business practices that seem innocuous. They seem very, run of the mill, but they actually lead to inequality and exclusivity. So those three dominant values are conformity, perfectionism, and toxic competition. So I'll walk through those.
Yeah,
so
please.
Conformity essentially is when a leadership team is confronted with change and difference, they default into seeking sameness because it feels safe. It's like a buttermilk biscuit. It feels good, but if you eat it at every meal, you'll feel sick. That's kind of what conformity is. But a lot of
in my case, at one meal, but yeah.
At one meal, right. And you're like, ooh, my stomach. But essentially, conformity is a default value that then drives the decision-making and the leadership practices. So a way to get away from that is to think about genuine acceptance of difference and seeing difference as a competitive advantage and as a strength. The second part is...
Sorry, can I just stop you on the first one for a moment, and we'll do the second one in a second? Just why?
Absolutely.
So, to me, some of the real talk of where the rubber hits the road here is, in any business, you're going to have to rely on defaults for some behavior. Yeah. Because if you question everything, of course, then you can grind to a halt really quickly. And in particular, in a lot of early companies, they're so focused on speed of execution that this desire to embrace difference runs into a desire for efficiency sometimes. Mm-hmm. And they can conflict with one another. I mean, there is a real trade-off there, or there can be, not always. And I'm just curious if you see that trade-off or you think that's not true. And if you do see the trade-off, any tips for people on how do you know how much to embrace discussion and embrace of difference versus when to be like, guys, we just need to get the meeting finished and go do, launch the product or whatever the thing is that is the reason for conformity.
You bring up such a great point about our assumptions around good policy and practice in business, which is we've got to move as quickly as possible. And that's not always true. It can lead to failures. It can lead to breaking things.
Of course.
But I think removing that assumption is a big part of it. And the second part is really not necessarily seeing conflict just for conflict's sake. It's essentially believing that there'll be different opinions and perspectives and values, and we should make space to be able to have genuine conversation and brainstorms around those, and not assuming that leadership means everyone has to think like me all the time to make it as quickly as possible. And the irony of that is a lot of leaders believe yes men or yes women is the best kind of team to have, when essentially you're probably not going to see any of the cracks in your decision making or strategy if you don't embrace some level of other opinions or perspectives. So this is a great example of this, right? Tina Kiefer, who's an organizational researcher, she was doing a leadership practice around what does a good leader actually look like? What does an efficient leader look like? And she was working with a group who spoke a different language than her. So she asked them to do a writing exercise. And so she was like, I want you to picture, what does an efficient leader actually look like? And on paper, almost every participant drew a man, and phenotypically drew someone with straight hair and light skin. And so she was like, oh, this is a fluke. There's no way that this is just a default, right? So they've repeated the practice dozens of times with other groups around the world, really. And almost every time, a majority of participants, regardless of demographics, draw somebody who's male in physical appearance. And I think it really helps us to unpack the assumption that our business practices around leadership, we assume who they should look like, what they should sound like, and ultimately what they should be doing to be considered a leader. That's
obviously, as a white man, I'm sure I've benefited from that invisibly and visibly in many ways my entire career. And I couldn't, I couldn't agree more that we carry all these assumptions that we think are just defaults, but really they embedded within them all these systems that are harmful. At the same time, and I want to go into perfectionism in a second, but at the same time, while of course speed is not always the right answer, speed is often the right answer, right? And so I think that for leaders, to me, it's about timing and dosage of just dialing up on embracing a little more pause, a little more opportunity to reflect on difference, a little bit more of like, wait a minute, hold on a second, because there is an irony here too, which is I've always wanted, I just admit my sin, conformity in people wanting inclusiveness, which even that is of course absurd. Anyway, but sorry, but I interrupted you because you were talking about perfection as that next thing, or if anything else you want to talk about.
Yeah, and you bring a really great point about defaults. So the core of my work is really around this concept of narrative intelligence, which is the idea that there's a psychological power of narrative, and it shapes our biases, our beliefs, and our behaviors presently. Your internal narratives you picked up from your families of origin, education, podcasts, you name it, they shape what you believe. And then you have a power of shaping narrative to change other people's thinking. So there are narrative defaults that we've picked up that we essentially, we literally use them for shortcuts.
Of course. And they're useful. By the way, they're not always bad. They're useful.
They can be useful, but they also many times,
totally harmful and useful.
Yeah, they don't have nuance. They don't allow people to essentially. So what we're doing here is what defaults are getting in the way of genuine innovation and collaboration. Because at the end of the day, you can move fast, you can be conforming, you can do all those things, and it'll likely lead to a culture of autopilot, which tons of research is showing they're disengaging employees, they're not innovating, they're not able to problem solve at scale. So even if you are defaulting in all the things that you know, it can lead down a path where you're not achieving the goals that you want to.
And like any dish that you're cooking, talking about biscuits, like, something that's good in one amount, you put too much of it in, you ruin the dish, too much of any of these things. But I interrupted you because you were talking about perfectionism as one of the other autopilot minutes to watch out for.
So another thing is the assumption that we can never get anything wrong ever, right? And that's kind of the idea of, okay, if it's not always right from the very beginning, then we shouldn't do it. And I think a great way to get away from that is to allow some wiggle room of experimentation and knowing we're going to iterate, we'll collect data, and then we'll pivot from there.
I love that.
When you're trying new initiatives, when you're hiring a new team, when you're implementing a new aspect of goals or culture, allow some room for learning. Because if you don't have that, you don't have the room or space to not default back into what you've always done. And we know that what you've always done doesn't necessarily lead to where you want to be or where you want to go. So
I love that.
Moving away from that into the idea of genuine collaboration is really important. And then the third thing was toxic competition. So we're taught in a lot of business practices that, hey, we're in a scarce situation. There's not enough resources to go around. Only so many people can be on top. And that leads to all types of toxic practices and behaviors. And moving away from toxic competition to collaboration is challenging, but it's important to do as a leader. So an example of this is I worked with the sales team who some of the sellers believed, well, I have to hoard information on my contacts. I have to not really.
You were a seller yourself before you did this.
Yes, I worked in sales for many years. I closed, 6.5 million in sales, working with different teams. And essentially the sellers who believed that hoarding information would lead to more closing of deals did poorly. They did terribly because there were so many inefficiencies and redundancies. So the sellers that actually shared information, tried to find win-win solutions for each of them in the sales deal, they were far more likely to be successful. So that's one tiny example of people.
Yeah, I love that example. And so much of that rings true to me. All of that rings true to me. And I'll just say the perfectionism thing, I think in a startup context, just to pick one business example, can be, it's nice because you're going to get a lot of things wrong. It's part of the tradecraft of startups. Right. And so you should be able to experiment more. And by the way, in large organizations too, there's a lot of internal things you can do that don't have to be perfect. Not everything has to be perfect. And I love, just the observations around that. I think that I guess the question it raises for me is like, okay, let's assume I accept all of these things about what the dangers are of autopilot culture. What do I do to then hold my team accountable to building something more exclusive, more inclusive?
So I have a framework that's called the status quo shifting method, which is really about creating a new narrative that can be unifying in sort of a purpose-driven way to get to a specific goal. And that requires what I call the 3 A's, which is awareness, accountability, and action.
I love it. We're getting the whole answer here.
We're getting the whole shebang, right? So awareness is really improving your cultural competency and understanding social, historical, cultural norms and how they've led to the present in your industry. And there's so many ways to do that: reading lists, training, all that stuff. Accountability is the process of narrative inquiry and self-reflection to understand your personal experiences with inclusion or exclusion. And
personal accountability, you mean?
Yes, your personal accountability. So for example, a lot of the time when we talk about inclusion, we're like, oh, that's the thing that like bad people do over there. So that's not really my problem. And if it is my
Sure, of
problem, all
course.
we need to think about is policies and practices. And we don't think about the root psychological sort of drivers of why people can be exclusive in their thinking and their leadership practices. So that self-reflection is like, I'm accountable and know my role that I play and how I perpetuate a culture of autopilot in my interactions and my decision making. And the final portion is action. So you can know the problem, be accountable to it, but if you have no plan, nothing's going to change. So action is, we're putting policies in place, practices, we're implementing inclusive behaviors and habits, like questions of curiosity is one of those. So I'll give a really quick example about this. So I was doing a training for a global development organization. So they work in 74 countries and they help various young people between the ages of 18 and 25 to work on various social impact projects. And the leadership team was primarily, what I think at the time, white, male, and fairly wealthy. And the people they were working with were impoverished and Black and brown people around the world. And so we were doing a self-reflection exercise around leadership. And I asked the people in this exercise, I want you to reflect on who were leaders in your life growing up. What did they look like? What were their demographics? And one of the participants, who was in his 60s, said, this is the first time I've realized I've never had a woman or a person of color as a leader my entire life. And I
benefited from my mom on that.
All of those practices and beliefs I have about who can lead, who can be visible, who can have a voice.
Totally.
And so that shift allowed him to start opening up to different practices and being conscious of how he was perpetuating or not perpetuating.
And I've found as an act of leadership on a team, getting back to this question of how do I hold others accountable, demonstrating that you're doing that work yourself can be very valuable, creating vulnerability, and it's a timing and dosage thing. You got to judge how much of it your team can take in at any given time, and asking others about the work that they're doing. I mean, I show up at board meetings and I'm like, okay, you have all these option grants. How many of these people are people of color? How, you can usually see from names how many of them are women. Not always.
Most people are very externally focused. They have little self-awareness.
That's right.
As a leader, being a powerful and influential and impactful leader requires self-awareness.
And look, I've been called on it by people we work with who, wagged their fingers at me and said I needed to do the work. And at the time I resented it. And it turns out I think they were more right than wrong. Right. And, your point about these examples, I'll just say this has been a pet peeve for me in business of the role models. Like, how many people have I heard quote Andy Grove about only the paranoid survive as justification for behaving paranoid at work?
Right.
A founder said to me, a very well-intentioned founder, said to me, I need to channel my inner Travis Kalanick here, meaning bluff and lie was what he meant. And then, by the way, Travis in his private business dealings had a reputation for being extremely scrupulous and straightforward. Maybe still has that reputation. And so it's like we take these lessons and perpetuate them because we think we need to do them to succeed. What if it had nothing to do with it? Maybe Steve Jobs being an asshole had nothing to do with Apple being successful.
And you bring up really great points about narrative. Do you see how they pick those up as dominant narratives of what does leadership look like? Here's a narrative that says, don't trust people, be scarce, be, lie about what you're doing. All these dominant narratives do then leak into how people build their companies. And now we're going through a reckoning because we have far more complex, diverse problems than we've ever had. And conventional practices are not going to solve them.
Amen.
So I think we have to shift the mindset and values before we can ever shift the practice.
I love that. Well, Christina, that is great. This is not advice. And the reason we say it's not advice, despite the fact you packaged it up beautifully and succinctly, is everybody's got to go through their own story. They're going to hear a hypothesis on what to do, and they're going to have to live through their story. And it would be great to have you back at some point if you're willing to. And I'm just really grateful. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And love having this conversation. I think it's never going to be solved overnight, inclusion.
No, but we're working on it.
It's like a muscle. I say it's like working out. If you had gone to the gym and you picked up one dumbbell one time, you wouldn't be like, I'm fit for
Totally. This is part of the trade craft of being a CEO. The same way you won't learn how to hire somebody well overnight. The very best people still work on it. Just keep going on it.
Absolutely.
All right. To be continued. Thank you.